So there it is, the merger that's been rumored for months. While everyone's been distracted by the latest AI hype cycle, Elon Musk just pulled off one of the most audacious financial maneuvers of the decade. And it might actually work. SpaceX just acquired xAI for an all-stock deal. On paper, this creates a mega company valued in the trillions that Musk plans to take public later this year. He's calling it the most ambitious, vertically integrated innovation engine on and off Earth. Data centers in space, AI-powered rockets, the whole 9 yards. Sounds incredible, right? Except xAI was losing $1 billion a month, and suddenly it's SpaceX's problem now. Before the Elon stans get all in their feelings and rush to post a negative comment, this isn't a gotcha piece. The man might actually pull this off. But the story of how we got here, that's where things get interesting. Let's break down what just happened, what Musk is really up to, and why you should care even if you don't own a single share of anything he's touched. So let's start at the top. According to Reuters, SpaceX is acquiring xAI in an all-stock deal, with xAI becoming a wholly owned but legally separate subsidiary of SpaceX as part of a planned mega IPO of the combined group later in 2026. Now, I think it's important to note a couple of things. First, these are privately held companies. They don't need to get shareholder approval or regulatory oversight like a normal publicly traded company, or any publicly traded company for that matter, would need. Now, there's a reason why he didn't have to get shareholder approval, because Musk's lawyers pulled a few interesting levers here. First, they coined and used a term, quote, of permitted holder, end quote, to avoid change of control provisions. Now, if you're unfamiliar, a change of control literally is what it sounds like. The control of the company goes from one entity or one group or one person to something else. Now, that change of control matters because typically in private companies with private investors or even debt holders, a change of control typically triggers a bunch of rights, a bunch of actions, a bunch of different things that effectively require those shareholders or those debt holders, those equity holders, whatever the case may be in that private company, to approve any transaction that would effectively change control. But since Elon is one of the only quote unquote permitted holders in this entire arrangement, he didn't need any shareholder approval. He could just do it. In addition, they used a triangular, quote, structure that effectively keeps xAI as its own company, but is wholly owned by SpaceX. Now, there's this provision for how to do this in Nevada state law. That's why you see a lot of these companies incorporate in Nevada. It's very business friendly. And so that effectively shields SpaceX from xAI's $12 billion in debt. And xAI debt holders would have no claim to SpaceX, and SpaceX would have no direct responsibility for that debt in the future. So if xAI defaulted on its debt, it would have no direct impact and create no financial liability for SpaceX. So those debt holders are pretty much screwed if xAI folds. xAI would have to restructure if it failed, and SpaceX wouldn't be able to show any kind of revenue from xAI as part of its total revenue. But xAI was likely never going to be profitable anyway from my perspective, but I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. You know, one of the best ways to support small YouTube channels is to subscribe to the channel. So if you're enjoying this content and like to see more of it, consider subscribing. Back to the episode. So why would Elon do this? Well, let's start with his own stated rationale. First, space data centers. Of course, there was very little detail on how any of that would work, but he claims that we need literally the space of space to build these. He's making the claim that we are going to run out of physical space for these data centers based on the demand for the amount of compute and the size of those data centers and the infrastructure required to run those data centers. We would literally run out of space. This is clearly a guy who's never driven through rural America. We are not running out of space anytime soon. He gets into some other claims around how he would power it and why there's advantages to being in space versus being terrestrial. I'm going to break down those numbers in a second. It's a doozy for sure. He also claims that there would be this shared resources and efficiencies between the companies, and they could share IP more easily and trade engineering talent or on a project basis. And I actually think there's some truth to that because they're doing that already. Directly from Elon himself, he says, quote, SpaceX has acquired xAI to form the most ambitious, vertically integrated innovation engine on and off Earth with AI, rockets, space-based internet, direct-to-mobile device communications, and the world's foremost real-time information and free speech platform. What a load of bullshit. I cannot believe he strung all those words together in one run-on sentence. And it really is silly, if we're being honest. But before I get into what I think the real motivations for Elon are, let's break down these claims. So the cost-benefit of data centers in space is an interesting one. Very few people have taken a holistic view of what that really looks like until, during my research, I found that Andrew McCallop, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly, kind of destroys this narrative because he factors in all the unique challenges and the massive cost to get compute to space and then back to terrestrial receiving stations, whatever that looks like. Again, no information's really been shared, but he does a basic breakdown mathematically and from an accounting perspective of the terrestrial cost per watt of usable power for compute versus what it would be in space. And so his terrestrial cost per watt is $15.85. The cost to do it in space, $51.18 per watt. And I really love what he said about this debate. He said, quote, I'm not here to dunk on anyone building real hardware. Space is hard, and shipping flight systems is a credibility filter. I'm annoyed at everyone else. This conversation is full of confident claims built on one cherry-picked fact and zero arithmetic. This is a multivariable physics problem with closed-formed constraints. If you're not doing the math, you're not contributing. You're adding noise and hyping for a future we all want instead of doing the hard work to actually drive reality forward. It gets pretty brutal. It gets also dead nuts accurate. And even Jensen Huang doesn't believe this is feasible. And he would likely be a supplier of GPUs for this ketamine-fueled hallucination. But the vertical integration part that Musk talks about does have a shred of truth to it. Musk-controlled companies already collaborate on things like materials for cars and starships. They literally look at things they build at Tesla based on what they've used on starships in SpaceX and satellites for Starlink. They can use predictive modeling. Obviously, xAI is a powerful enough tool to create predictive modeling for SpaceX and for any of the other companies. And some of the software engineering talent and hardware engineering talent is shared between these different companies already. So there are some real efficiencies that they could leverage. But those opportunities probably equate to millions of dollars in savings, whereas the cost for pulling any of this off is in the billions, if not trillions. And the transaction itself kind of sucks for SpaceX investors. xAI was operating at a $1 billion per month loss. The drain on the operating cash from SpaceX could be severe. So if xAI is operating at $1 billion per month loss, and SpaceX generated about $15 billion last year through a combination of launch services and Starlink revenue, if something doesn't change in the loss rate or the burn rate for xAI, it could eat up almost all of SpaceX's revenue or the equivalent of SpaceX's revenue total for 2025. So that's not great if you're a SpaceX investor who isn't also in xAI. So now those investors in SpaceX itself have to absorb a company that's operating at a huge annualized loss, and they're trying to go public later this year. So that feels like a drag on the valuation or the potential revenue creation profit, certainly, for SpaceX going into an IPO. So that also doesn't feel terribly strategic. Now, about that IPO, Musk has publicly said he wants SpaceX to go public with a valuation of between $1.2 and $1.5 trillion. To put that in perspective, there's only been one IPO that listed with $1 trillion plus valuation, and that was Saudi Aramco in 2019. Now, Saudi Aramco, if you're not familiar, is one of the largest companies or conglomerates in the world and generates hundreds of billions of dollars in profit every year. And then the second largest, again, to put this in perspective, was Alibaba at $230 billion. So there's quite a gap there. And for even more context, that $1 trillion valuation puts SpaceX at a sales to price ratio of nearly 65 times. As an aside, he wants to IPO SpaceX in 2026 with that implied market cap of $1.5 trillion, and he might actually get it. So as crazy as it sounds, there are a couple of reasons why he could actually pull this off. First, SpaceX is virtually unchallenged in orbital operations. Its at least partial recovery of Starships does create some savings for launch services that they can pass on and become more price competitive in that market. It also has pretty healthy margins, all things considered, for what it's doing. There's just not a lot of competition in that space. The second reason, Starlink is growing like crazy and closes the digital divide better than anything else on the market. It really is an astonishing product. So regardless of how you feel about Elon Musk or his companies, Starlink is a undeniably solid product. And then third, it's just the Elon trade. We've seen this dozens of times before, and we've seen it in almost every company, public or private, that he's involved with. There's this irrational belief in Musk's ability to deliver on his lofty promises, and everything that he says is coming. People buy into the notion of colonies on Mars and landing on the moon and developing all of these technologies around Tesla's full self-driving, which still isn't full self-driving, or robo-taxis that are still running into stuff at an alarming rate, or Optimus robots that can't do the dishes, but somehow believes people will pay $50,000 to watch it eat popcorn. I don't really know. The point is that this Elon trade is very real and people buy into it, and so he might actually pull this off. Here's why I think he's actually doing it. First, xAI can't compete with the other enterprise-grade LLMs and AI platforms. It just was too late to the party. The question becomes, is it competitive as its own platform? Doesn't appear to be. And it was burning cash much faster than it could raise it. There was a point at which xAI was not going to be able to raise more private capital given its $1 billion a month burn rate and the belief that maybe it's falling behind in the AI race. Musk can hide the losses of xAI within the X platform, and what I mean by hide is when you put these two things together, now it starts being some line items within a larger P&L. Remember, xAI will be its own company, but will be wholly owned by SpaceX. So SpaceX will have some line items in its profit and loss report, P&L report, that will account for the losses and the revenue from the individual entity that is xAI, but it's going to get buried under headline numbers around Starlink's revenue, SpaceX's revenue, the share price, all of those things. So it basically gets put into the shadows and hidden from scrutiny. It's just a way of kind of nesting this thing in there, and people stop asking questions about it. And I do think this hurts SpaceX in the short term because I think SpaceX is the best company that Musk has. Starlink, obviously part of SpaceX. So if I was really specific, I might say that Starlink is the best product within the Elon Musk universe, but SpaceX as a company, clearly differentiated, clearly growing, clearly able to produce technology and launch services that nobody else can. It's just undeniably a successful company. This also would allow Musk to move assets and contracts, capital, even resources between companies as needed. Little low on cash at xAI for operations, then maybe you sell a very friendly and very overpriced contract to SpaceX. Maybe you lend out some executives at 4 times their billable rate or 4 times their actual cost to the parent company. And to be clear, this is already happening. We see this within the different Musk universe of companies, including SpaceX buying what was rumored to be 2,000 Cybertrucks from Tesla when they couldn't sell them and they were just sitting around on storage lots. And instead of having individual companies under scrutiny or pricing pressure, he can promote the best of the performance within the portfolio of companies or the individual companies nested within a SpaceX, while he can still hide or downplay any contraction in the individual business unit. So xAI gets off on revenue. Well, how do we boost that some other way? Or we just don't even talk about it, right? Don't look at this hand, look at this hand over here, or whatever diversion tactic he needs to pull. He can also claim that SpaceX is now a much bigger and more valuable company ahead of the IPO. That's a little bit of jazz hands. It's a little bit of exaggeration, to say the least, because xAI was a relatively small company from a revenue standpoint, and it wasn't like SpaceX didn't already have access to that technology in those models anyway, but I'm sure he'll paint the picture that this is now a much bigger, much more valuable, much more capable company, and frankly speaking, he's a master marketer, so he'll probably pull that off too. This also sets up a potential merger between Tesla and SpaceX. Now, there's a lot of ways that could be difficult to pull off, but this is something that's been rumored for a long time, and just like xAI being absorbed by SpaceX was rumored for a long time, the Tesla into SpaceX could be the next logical move in all of this financial shenanigans and all this moving around of ownership. It's a little more complicated because at that point, SpaceX and Tesla will both be publicly traded companies, and it will be harder for them to merge or acquire just based on their individual market caps, being, even if SpaceX does IPO at $1.5 trillion, basically put it on par with Tesla's market value. So neither one is bigger than the other, so you couldn't do a direct stock swap. Somebody would have to take on some debt, pay some cash. It would be a lot messier to do, but this certainly sets a precedent for that happening. And if that were to happen, understand that that's just a massive contingency plan for when or if Tesla continues to struggle with declining sales and market share. Their latest quarterly report shows their profit is way off. Their market share continues to go down by high single, if not low double digits year over year. And so it could be the ultimate bailout for Tesla, as opposed to just shutting it down or admitting defeat, which Elon doesn't seem to ever want to do. And this last one, maybe most importantly, and maybe the biggest motivator for Elon Musk, is he would become a trillionaire before the end of 2026. So there's that. Why am I skeptical of Musk and this supposedly fantastic merger? Well, besides it being batshit crazy on the face of it, companies with successful and growing businesses don't normally consolidate. They do the exact opposite. GE split itself into multiple divisions and increased shareholder value by several hundreds of billions of dollars by splitting into GE Healthcare, GE Aviation, GE Energy. And by taking these individual operations of those companies, of those operations from the GE parent company and spinning them out, they generated a lot more capital, and the values for each one of those soared because they were no longer valued together, they were valued separately. And this happens all the time, and Elon knows this. You got to remember, his payment company was acquired by PayPal, which means he was effectively acqui-hired by PayPal. He'll say that he's a founder of PayPal, which is another version of Elon Musk's revisionist history, but I'll put that aside for right now. PayPal split off of eBay, and before the split, the combined eBay company was valued at around $70 to $75 billion. But within the first year or so of splitting PayPal out, or spinning PayPal out of eBay, the standalone market cap moved well above $50 billion just for PayPal, and at points was north of $60 billion, and eBay's remained in the 30-ish billion range. Again, Elon will claim this creates synergies and efficiencies that couldn't be realized any other way. But this is the same guy that has a very loose relationship with the truth. He certainly has an unhinged relationship with timelines. We're still waiting on that FSD he promised. We were all supposed to be able to hire our Teslas out as driverless Ubers by now. It will make the Tesla stands and Musk chatbots happy to know that I still wouldn't bet against him. Nothing he does makes sense, and it all sounds, and is often proven to be, complete horseshit. But that doesn't seem to matter. Enough people have billions invested in the Elon trade, and they all seem to be committed to riding it out, even if it goes to zero. And I don't think it will go to zero. More likely, Tesla's rolled into SpaceX, and that with xAI become footnote products with increasingly diminished standing in the Elon ecosystem. Data centers in space never come to fruition, but Starlink and SpaceX launch services continue to grow. Now, why do I think data centers in space never come to fruition? Because I don't think the need is there, and because I don't think you can manage the costs compared to terrestrial data. I also think that data centers and compute is going to get increasingly more efficient. And given all of this machination and kind of re-emphasizing the winners and de-emphasizing the losers, at some point investors stop caring about Tesla and xAI being shell companies. They're reduced to line items on the P&L report of SpaceX, and they're perfectly okay with that, provided that SpaceX continues to grow at an unbelievable clip. I mean, maybe we finally see robotaxis and Optimus robots, but that's not really the point. Musk's whole arc is getting investors and customers to buy into the next thing. And as long as he can continue to sell pipe dream products and ideas, he'll continue his march to becoming the world's first multi-trillionaire. I'm not the guy to call Elon a fraud or even insinuate he is. I think that's a lazy analysis of what's actually happening. The guy's company has built real rockets that land themselves. He cornered the market on launch services for the entire planet. Starlink is connecting people who've never had reliable internet access and can be deployed in minutes. Those are very real and meaningful achievements. But this xAI merger, this isn't innovation. This is financial engineering at its finest, or most desperate, depending on how you look at it. Truth is, it doesn't matter if I'm right. It doesn't matter if you're skeptical, because enough people have so much money riding on the Elon trade that they're stubbornly committed at this point. They're going to ride this horse all the way to the glue factory. My hot take is Tesla eventually gets rolled into SpaceX, and then the cracks really start showing. Data centers in space quietly disappear from the roadmap. xAI becomes a line item nobody talks about. But Starlink keeps growing. SpaceX keeps launching. Before you know it, nobody cares anymore that the other stuff didn't pan out, because that's the diversion required for this sleight of hand to work. Keep everyone looking at the next thing. The robo-taxis coming next year, the $1 trillion valuation coming in 2026, the Mars colony coming in a decade. And almost inevitably, Elon Musk becomes the world's first multi-trillionaire, while we're all still waiting for full self-driving. That's it for this episode. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.